speaking of homework, I blew it. Um, there was a question in there, the one about the wagon load of food. I don't know how that got in there. It didn't belong in there. It wasn't a part of your reading. I'm so sorry about that because some of you probably search for that. Anyway, I'm going to give you the point. Obviously, if you got it wrong, some of you may have gotten it right. So anyway, don't worry about that. I'll be taking care of that once everybody has taken the quiz. So my apologies for that. Hopefully that I actually knew about it last year, and I thought I took care of it. So I don't know what happened. So anyway, I will endeavor to get that taken care of. All right. For next week, we get into the book. Oh, I hope you didn't really spend an hour on that one for that question, Grace. I'm so sorry. I will, anyway, should give you 10 points for that. No, I'm just kidding. Anyway, for next week, we're in the book, read pages 1 to 19 in the textbook, and answer the chapter ending questions in your textbook by typing your answers to the questions on pages 18 to 19 into a Word document, and then you upload that to me in the assignments tab, okay? Now, make sure that you type your full name and section number at the top of the page, okay? So, just be thinking, as Mr. Pratt prints this out, he needs to know whose assignment this is, okay? So please put your name and you guys are section 2. Yes, I do print them. Well, usually I do. Sometimes I don't. But even if I open it up, I want to be able to know whose it is. So I take points off if you don't do that. So heads up on that. Then you also have an open book quiz based on the chapter. So 2 things based on the chapter this week. And then you will also see at the end of the chapter, I'm going to be giving you the Constitution to read, but in little bitty chunks, okay? So you read a little bit of the Constitution in Appendix A, and then you just summarize briefly what you've read in Appendix B, or as you see there, or in the file I've provided you in the study place. So in other words, in study place, you can print out basically what amounts to Appendix B, and then that way you can just type it in there, and then that way you've got that for your notes. And plus you can keep your book clean. So, but you could do it either way. Some of you may want to may want to write it in the book so that you have it there. So either way is fine. And then take the poll in the assignments tab to indicate you've done this. So in other words, once you've done it, just yes, I did it, and boom, you're done with that. Okay? And then, of course, continue memorizing Romans 13, 1, 2, and 4 in the ESV. You've got the slides for that in the earlier classes. By the way, remember to check the message tab at the end of each class. Hopefully you've been looking at that. That gives you some discussion questions to stump your parents. And yeah, good discussion questions, and plus it just makes sure you've got everything in terms of what you're doing for homework. And of course, don't forget to print out the PDF file to help you take notes. Is everybody doing that before class? Are you finding that helpful? Hopefully you're finding that helpful. Okay, good. In regard to homework, remember, I follow Potter School policy, 10% reduction for each day. Homework is late, so make sure you get it in on time, okay? All right, any questions on what's upcoming? Questions, because I've got answers, maybe. All right. Well, just to review a little bit, we've been looking at what it means to have a biblical worldview versus the man-centered view. Specifically, we've been applying this to the subject of government. Go figure, right? I mean, it's like this is becoming a government class or something. So let's start off with a verse that I've kind of referenced, but we haven't really looked at, and that's Judges 21:25. Judges 21:25. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Now, this verse here actually appears several times in the book of Judges, but it's also the last verse in the book of Judges. Now, let me ask you, as you look at that verse, what do you think it's saying about the people in the days of Judges? When it says in those days there was no king in Israel, everyone did what was right in his own eyes, what is that saying, do you think, about the people in that day? What were they like? What is this trying to say about that generation? Everyone did whatever they wanted. They probably a lot of evil going on. They lived in anarchy. Yeah, they did whatever seemed right to them. There were no restraints. There was no king to restrain them. It does sound like anarchy. Quite frankly, it doesn't sound like a fun time period to have been living. But you know, when you think about it, that is the guiding principle of the man-centered view. You can do whatever seems right to you, or whatever you get a majority vote to do. And when you think about it, you know, under this principle, under this way of thinking, how could we ever question what Hitler did and say that what he did was wrong, or what Pharaoh did was wrong? If everybody decides for themselves what's right and wrong, how can you say that what they did is wrong? Okay, so that's a big problem with the man-centered view. Now, then there's the biblical worldview, okay, where God above gives us laws to live by. And we looked at Romans 13, which talks a lot about the civil magistrate, and it says that God has given the civil officials authority. By the way, what do you think it means that God has given authority to them? Can they do whatever they like if they have authority? Are they just allowed to make up things as they go along, do whatever they want? No, no, and no, right? Not if they have authority, because God hems them in regarding the types of laws that they can pass, right? So God hems them in regarding the types of laws that they can pass. And this is something that King Alfred understood. King Alfred, we're going to be talking a lot about him, but and we've already started talking about him, but look at what a blessing his laws were for England. Like, notice his first law. You can almost just hear this in a Yoda voice. Love thou not other strange gods over me. You know, just such a weird English construction, right? But, you know, think about it. If we had a clear statement in our Constitution that Jesus was the king of our country, would it be easy for teachers to be punished for opening a class in prayer? Could a senior in high school be reprimanded for saying the word Jesus in his or her valedictorian speech? I mean, you know, if we had a clear law that acknowledged Jesus as the king of our country, it would be difficult to punish such lawful activity. By the way, I should mention the Constitution does make a reference to Jesus. Does anybody know what it is? It is the reference to in the year of our Lord, 1787, which of course is 1787 years after the birth of Christ. Yeah, some people say, oh, well, that's not that big a deal. That's just how they talk. And yet it was a reference to Jesus. However, something like what King Alfred did would certainly have solidified things even better. Look at law number 25. You know, with a law like that saying it's okay to defend yourselves, it makes it a lot harder for officials to pass laws that make it difficult for people to defend themselves, like what Granny Smith did, as we discussed last week. But see, that's the beauty of what King Alfred did. So we've talked about how God gives authority to civil officials just like he gives authority to parents. You know, we've talked about how God hems in officials in terms of what laws they can pass, just like he hems in parents. I mean, a parent can't legitimately ask a child to lie or steal or something like that. I mean, a parent might have the power to do that, but not the authority. So we've talked about authority in terms of what laws can be passed, but we also need to discuss punishment, because when somebody breaks the law, Well, naturally, there's got to be a punishment associated with it. Well, what's the punishment? And who decides what the punishment should be? There's many views of punishment. And what one decides, again, not surprisingly, it's going to depend on your worldview. Now, let's take this back a little. In the biblical worldview, what causes crime? In the biblical worldview, in the biblical way of thinking, what causes crime? Sin. Exactly right. And look at what Jesus said. What comes out of a man is what makes him unclean. For from within, out of men's hearts, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality. Notice Jesus lists some crimes here: theft, murder, adultery. And then you've also got greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. All these evils come from inside and make a man unclean. All right? So that's Jesus' words. Under the biblical way of thinking, it's what's inside of us that's sinful. That's what leads to sinful thoughts, actions, and even crime. Okay? Now, that's the biblical worldview. Under the man-centered view, what causes crime? And I'll explain why I have that portrait there in a second. But first the question, by the way, this, of course, the Garden of Eden, where all the plants are strategically located to hide parts that we should not be looking at. Don't you love, like, every drawing you ever see? I mean, garden was just so full of plants, and, Eve's hair is so long, and so you never see anything inappropriate. Very, very clever. But in the man-centered view, because you're still probably wondering, what does this have to do with the Garden of Eden? Convenient plants, yes. What causes crime in the man-centered view? There's actually a hint with this portrait. Moral deprecation. Plants, fruit, apples. No, and no. But nice guess. No, in the man-centered... Yes! Thank you, Jeremiah. Blaming others. Or to put it in the modern-day vernacular, the environment. When I say the environment, I don't mean the earth. I mean like society. I mean, in other words, the problem is not inside of you, it's outside of you. It's everybody else. Of course, if it's everybody else, how can it not be inside of them? In one sense, that view doesn't make sense. But we're talking about the whole idea of blame shifting. Well, how did this happen in the Garden of Eden? I mean, obviously God comes to Adam, and Adam says, it's not my fault, she made me do it. Goes to Eve, and she's like, why, Lordy, it's not my fault, it's the serpent's fault. Because don't you know she was blonde like that? Actually, genetically speaking, you know that neither Adam and Eve would have been white skin and blonde. Like that, like geneticists have ruled out. But, you see it in almost every Garden of Eden picture. It's kind of funny. But so here we have the first examples of blame shifting, and we still do it today. I mean, I could give you tons of examples, but this is such a classic example that even though it comes from the 60s, this is just a perfect example. Aaron Charles Mitchell was sentenced to death for murdering a police officer. Listen to what his attorney said. This is not the quote that you have in your notes, by the way, so just listen. His attorney said, had this man been fortunate enough to have been given white skin, okay, because Aaron Charles Mitchell was black, he undoubtedly could have wound up in the seat now occupied by Your Honor. So you get that? So what's the reason why he's resorted to crime and he killed a police officer? It's not because he's a bad guy. It's because of things that he had no control over. His skin color, the fact that he didn't grow up in an environment like you did, Judge, and he's not rich and with a powerful position. And so, all these external factors drove him to crime. In fact, Aaron Charles Mitchell, was quite a good student. Learned quickly from his attorney, because this is what he told the press later. What people ought to be trying to find out about me is what it was in my environment that caused me to go bad. Again, this is not talking about like waves emanating from the planet. No, my environment, in other words, my circumstances. Mitchell pointed out that he was born in Mississippi and moved to Memphis, Tennessee when he was 5, and there was just such poverty that he was living in, and his parents broke up when he was 14 or 15. So you put it all together, what caused this guy to go bad? Well, it was his skin color because, racism, poverty, divorce, all these things. His parents must have fed him bad fruit. Yes, that's the lesson of the garden, right? But, Jesus said it's not any of those things. What comes out of a man is what makes him unclean. Lots of people have faced the things that Aaron Charles Mitchell's faced. They have faced racism. They've faced poverty. They've faced divorce. And they didn't turn to crime. Jesus said it's the sin in the individual person's heart. And so in God's system, not unsurprisingly, punishment focuses on punishing the offender and restoring the victim. Okay? Punishing the offender because, after all, sin is in the offender. Sin is in his heart. But that's not the driving principle of the man-centered view. Because, after all, if the cause of crime is in the environment, then what's the answer? If the cause of crime is in the environment, what's the answer? What do you think? Think about it. If the problem is the environment, then where do you focus law or retribution? Jeremiah says us. Yeah, as Hannah says, change the environment. Exactly right. You have to fix the environment. So you don't necessarily emphasize punishing the person. You emphasize fixing the environment. And I know that may sound crazy. You almost have to stop thinking like a Christian for a second to understand their way of thinking. See, under the man-centered view, the primary duty is not to punish crime as we know it, to punish murder and things like that. I mean, they may do that, but that's not their primary focus because, after all, the government may engage in murder. Why might they engage in murder? Well, to change the environment, to change the society. And of course, we've seen many examples like this. The Nazis killing off the Jews, communists killing off the rich bourgeois. You see this in Muslim countries like Sudan. They killed off the Christians. In other words, government's official policy was to murder people because they were trying to get the environment or the society they desire. For the man-centered view, evil is primarily in the society. Now, James says, to be fair, there is a small, but albeit there, inkling of truth in there. The environment influences how we behave towards certain things. Now, that is true, that our environment can influence, but you notice, if you come from a biblical point of view, the answer to that is yes, but we are still responsible for resisting that influence. In fact, several places in the scriptures makes it clear that the children are not to be punished for the sins of the parents, that we're responsible for what we do. And so even, go back to Aaron Charles Mitchell. There's a lot of people that have faced racism and never resorted to crime. There's a lot of people that have grown up in poverty or their parents got divorced. And so, in other words, it is possible to face those tempting situations, to face those depressing situations, and not let it turn you into being angry and bitter. Because after all, let's say somebody's being very racist towards you. Okay, that's not good. Now, does that mean you necessarily have to respond with violence? No, because Jesus and, the scriptures say the answer is you forgive. That's how Jesus responded to lousy treatment on the cross, right? He prayed, Father, forgive them. So we're responsible for the way that we respond. But, to the man-centered view, because they're not taking God's point of view on this, for them, they see evil in the society, and after all, you might need to cut down a few people like trees to get the environment or the society you want. See, under this thinking, law is not to be a terror to evildoers. That's what Romans 13 says. Law is a terror to evildoers. Instead, law is meant as an instrument to change society. That's what the non-Christian mind will use the law for. It's to change society. You know, in this country, government is not murdering people, but we do use the law to change society. And I'll give you a few examples of that. There you have depicted the two main camps in politics today. What are they? What are the two main camps in politics depicted by the elephant and the donkey? Republican and Democrat. Yes. And then, so that's in terms of party politics, but then you also have philosophical divisions, and they're typically portrayed as liberal versus conservative or libertarian, or you have socialists. So you've got different philosophies, different ways of thinking. But what I'd like to do is take the two chief philosophies, the liberal versus conservative viewpoints, and ask the question, how do they use the law to change society? How do they use law to change society? Now let's start with the liberal view. Okay, we're going to examine the liberal view first and then the conservative view. How do liberals try to change the environment? I'll give you one hint there, although there's certainly many ways that liberals try to use the law to change society. But what are some of the ways? Yeah, ban everything that's offensive. Exactly. So, so if somebody uses a gun in a crime, while we might deal with the person who used the gun, really we want to control everybody else's guns, or even better, take all the guns away. And there have been certain cities that went that approach of banning firearms entirely. They quickly became the most dangerous places to live, by the way. But so in other words, that's one way of cleaning up the environment, is we're going to ban all the guns. What are, and of course, Ella said ban everything. So yeah, what are other things that might get banned? Like Bible reading and prayer in schools, right? Now, Nicholas has lots of taxes. Why would that be a way of improving the environment? And you're absolutely right, Nick. Lots of taxes. Why? What does lots of taxes help you do or allow you to do? So the government can do what they need. Yeah, it makes, and that's what liberals tend to be, is that they want government to do everything, fix everything, fund everything. Also, lots of taxes to redistribute money, because if, kind of like Robin Hood, take from the rich, spread it around to the poor, and we'll put more money into education. We'll make people better. We'll put more money into all kinds of things. By the way, who can forget, if we're going to improve society, then we definitely need to get rid of those undesirable types. And there are some liberals who have talked this way. Anybody know who Margaret Sanger is? Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood. Planned Parenthood's been in the news lately, right? Because they, are supportive of chopping up little babies while they are in the womb and saving the less crunchy parts, saving the good parts so that they can sell them for profit. Well, I guess that's the whole debate. Were they selling them for profit or not? What's not in debate is that they were harvesting baby organs and selling them. Well, Margaret Sanger's idea was there were certain types of people, like those who didn't have white skin, maybe those who were criminals, and we don't want them to propagate their, we don't want them to have children. So she favored eugenics, which is like sterilization and things like that. She favored abortion. Do I really need to state my view? What is your view of abortion? Uh, that it's murder? Um, so, the liberal view says we're going to improve society by, uh, we're going to, by banning things, by taking people's money and throwing money at ways at things that need improving. But don't forget, we're also going to even try to determine which kind of people are going to have babies or have babies successfully. I mean, Margaret Sanger's idea was that she wanted blacks to be the ones that are using abortion. And sadly, as you look at the statistics, I mean, it's almost been like a genocide amongst blacks. I forget what the percentages are, but it is an extreme percentage of black babies that are murdered through abortion. So that's the liberal view, okay, is we're going to perfect society using the law. Now, let's look at the conservative view. How do conservatives try to use the law in an unbiblical way to change society? Now, I realize this may be a little harder for you guys because I imagine that most, if not all of you, come from a politically conservative background. I mean, statistically speaking, in the Potter School, that's what I see, and that's certainly where I come from that background. So it's kind of hard to look at the holes in your own view. But let me say this, when Jesus was on the earth, he had tough words, not just for the Sadducees, who in that day and age, they were the religious liberals, and I say liberals because they didn't believe in the afterlife. They didn't believe God's word was really true. So they were very liberal in that sense. But he also blasted the Pharisees. And the Pharisees, you might say, were the religious conservatives. I mean, if we were to go back to Jesus' day, we would probably share more in common with the Pharisees because, they believed in the Word of God. They took God's Word seriously in many cases, although they twisted God's Word, and that's what Jesus rebuked them for. But at least verbally, they assented to taking God's Word seriously. They believed in heaven and the afterlife, something that the Sadducees didn't believe. And yet, even though we would have all this agreement with them in those ways, Jesus rebuked them quite harshly. In fact, you might even say even more harshly, right? So the point is, sometimes both views, sometimes both the liberals and the conservatives are wrong. And so that brings us back to the question, how do conservatives try to use the law in an unbiblical way to change society? James says money, and conservatives do that too. They're not supposed to, because they're supposed to believe in small government and low tax rates, but increasingly more people who call themselves conservatives are want to, like Donald Trump calls himself a conservative, okay? And yet he wants to, you can find examples where he wants to raise taxes. You can find examples where he wants to spend money on things that I would argue government shouldn't be spending money on. But what are some of the ways that conservatives try to use the law in an unbiblical way? How about if we go back almost 100 years, prohibition? We're going to stop people from getting drunk by banning an object, which is helping them get drunk. It's funny, and I know this can be controversial in the Christian community, and by and large, it was religious Christians who were pushing prohibition. But in Sunday school once I had a discussion, and my personal view is, what I understand from the Bible, getting drunk is a sin, but God does not condemn drinking. And I gave this gentleman the example, if alcohol was evil in and of itself, why did Jesus change the water into wine? And he said, because the water was so bad in those days. So he was cleaning up, he was giving them something better to drink. And I said, well, if that's the case, then why didn't he just purify the water? Why, why change it into something that's sinful, if it indeed is sinful? Yeah. It's funny how we do contortions when we have something in our mind that, it's like, that's the way it is. But anyway, so prohibition, I would say, was one example, because that was not pushed by liberals. That was pushed by religious conservatives. And, they had very good motives for doing that. I get that, because drunkenness was a huge problem. I mean, it still is. Yeah. Well, illegal drugs, I would probably take in the same way, Christina, that, it's the difference between what is a sin versus what is a crime. And not every sin needs to be turned into a crime. And so I would use alcohol as the example for that. But then think, too, just in terms of what conservatives do, think of the lecture, the number 4 lecture on the DVD that you heard, because it talked about the prison system as a form of punishment, right? And after all, what is the real goal of the prison system? What's the real goal of the prison system? Some say that it's to punish and reform criminals. And that was actually the original idea behind the prison system. Right? Yeah, make you sorry, make you penitent, right? But in reality, the prison system doesn't reform criminals, and studies show that. A majority of criminals, when released from prison, will commit another crime within 3 years. The best thing, I think, for reforming a criminal is if they come to Christ in prison. But prison itself doesn't make bad guys better. So why then do people support the prison system? Why do people support the prison system? Well, ultimately, what you hear today is that it is to clean up the environment. Take this as just one example. It's a story from my local area here in D.C., but it's just one example of thousands like this. A 32-year-old D.C. woman has pled guilty to conning her way into people's homes and stealing from their wallets when they were not looking. Bonita Piper faces up to 30 years on each of 3 burglary counts when she is sentenced in the spring. Now, do the math there real quick. How many years in prison is she facing? I mean, it's something stunning. 90 years. Yeah, 30 years on each of 3 burglary counts. 90 years. Now, I realize how our prison system works. Even 30 years would be a lot. But 90 years. The way our prison system works, they come at the criminal with a huge amount of prison time, and then they try to plea bargain it down to a smaller sentence. Now, I understand that's how the system works. Of course, in God's system, a thief would not spend any time in jail. What? No time in jail? Yeah, what's God's answer for theft? It's actually not jail time. It is, what do you guys think? Repay what was stolen. Yeah, think of Zacchaeus. That's exactly what he said he was going to do. But if Bonita Piper had a lousy defense attorney, or if she defended herself, which isn't smart, she could wind up with a huge amount of time in jail for a relatively minor offense. And sadly, that does happen. But that is the classic conservative view. You clean up society by throwing bad guys in jail, and you throw away the key. And there is a degree to which this works to reduce crime. I mean, let's face it, if you take bad guys off the street, you will tend to lower crime. I mean, it's called the broken windows theory of law enforcement. You take the bad people off the street, you throw them in prison, you throw away the key, and you've got a safer society. I would say, at what cost are we doing this? Because here's what happens. When they're in prison, they become better schooled in crime each time they spend time in prison. Studies show that they become better at doing their craft, which is being bad, which is breaking the law. Not only that, it places a huge tax burden on the citizens, because it costs us taxpayers $20,000 a year per inmate. And eventually, and this has already happened in many places, in many states, the tax burden becomes so great that they cut costs. How? By releasing criminals back out onto the streets. So they go back out on the streets anyway early. And so what was the point? So we've just paid for them to be in prison, to be in a school that teaches them how to be better criminals. So I would ask, is there a better approach? Well, yeah, it would be called God's approach. Let's review the DVD. When were prisons started as a form of punishment in the United States? When were prisons started as a form of punishment? Good, the 1790s. Yeah, you can fill that in the blank. 1790s. The Quaker Oats there was not to say that they were eating oatmeal in prison. Although, I don't know, maybe they were. But no, it was started by the Quakers in Pennsylvania. Now, here's the thing. Nowhere are prisons seen in the Bible as a godly model. Did that surprise you to hear that? When you heard that, did you think, like, Mr. Pratt has lost it? I'll be honest, the first time I ever heard somebody say that prisons are an ungodly system, that God never, like, that blew me away. Because, I mean, let's face it, we've grown up in a society that has it, and so Paul says the law is a teacher. And so you grow up with a certain way of thinking, and you just can't think of any other way of doing something. But isn't it interesting that it wasn't God's way or suggested way of doing things, and neither was it for our founding fathers, who tended to be very biblical? What does Romans 13 say is the job of the civil authorities? Their job is to do what? Redistribute wealth? Fix every problem? No. It is to, thank you, punish the wrongdoer, punish evildoers, right? He's a servant or minister, as some translations say, of God's justice. He is God's servant, an agent of wrath to bring punishment. Well, what are the civil punishments that were prescribed for Israel and modeled by our founding fathers in our early country? What are the civil punishments that God says we should use? As opposed to death, as opposed to prison, and you do see prison in ungodly systems. You see it in Egypt. You see it in Rome. You even see it in Israel under the kings when they've gotten away from God's word. But otherwise, you didn't see it prescribed in God's law. You don't see prisons. So what were the penalties? How did you punish bad guys? Execution, restitution, hey, that rhymes, and flogging. Yeah, there you go. There's your three: death, restitution, and corporal punishment or flogging. And there you see the passages associated with it. That was actually what we had in the colonies for a couple hundred years. And what they were doing was they were modeling a biblical approach. Now, as you might imagine, some saw these punishments as too severe. In fact, that's why the Quakers started the penitentiary system. They thought that these types of punishments were too harsh, so they wanted something that was, quote unquote, kinder and gentler. We're going to make people be penitent. They especially thought capital punishment was too harsh. Now, you may not have thought much about this, and you may think, well, you know, that's just an Old Testament thing. It doesn't apply today. Or you might think that, you know, God isn't like that anymore. Although it does say that God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. But let's take a look at this. And in doing that, I want to start off with a story. You all like stories? I'm sure you do. Like bedtime stories? Okay, you just can't fall asleep, all right? Who here was alive in, yay, story time, in 1988? Any of you? I don't think any of you were you? You were not. Stop it, you old people, you. So, yeah, our story is going to, well, actually, it goes beyond 1988. It ends in 88. It actually begins in 1974. Certainly none of you were around in 74, right? Well, we're going to look at a story that demonstrates the different views of government, how the man-centered view wants to change the environment, but how the biblical worldview actually protects victims. Now, 1974, here's what was happening. You're like, whoa, what is all this? All right, let me explain each frame. Upper left-hand corner, President Richard Nixon became the first president to resign from office. That was the whole Watergate scandal. In the lower center, you've got Gerald Ford, who became president after him and then pardoned Nixon. In the upper right, that signifies the OPEC countries. They had an oil embargo against us going, and that combined with our federal government imposing price controls resulted in long gas lines. That was a painful period to live in. In culture and society, as Grace points out, there's Kiss. They introduced their first album in 1974. Yes, they are that old. You still see them in commercials. Heck, Mall Cop 2 had Kiss. It was a pretty funny scene if you've seen that. But anyway, in the lower right, anybody know who that is? This was my favorite band in 1974. It's almost embarrassing to say that. But ABBA, you know, with Dancing Queen and Mamma Mia. I mean, some of their songs have, come back around. They even had a movie not too long ago about them. But anyway, they won the Eurovision Song Contest in 1974, so they were becoming big. In sports, it was the Oakland A's and the Miami Dolphins who were on top of their game, won the World Series and the Super Bowl. So that's what was going on in 1974. So our story that we're going to look at begins in 74. Again, it demonstrates the different views of government, how the man-centered view wants to change the environment, how the biblical worldview wants to protect victims. So, story begins with Willie Horton, a brutal murderer who in 1974 robbed a gas station in Massachusetts. He stabbed the attendant, the clerk there, 19 times and left him to bleed and die in a trash can. Very gruesome, very sad story. The upside is that he was captured, he was put in jail for years and years and years and years and years, although he was not executed. So fast forward to 1988, and this is where our story ultimately ends, but not yet. But let me just say about 1988, since I'm giving you what happened in 1974, 1988 was a fantastic year. I know you guys weren't alive yet, but it was the year, it was still the era of big hair, and that is when a wonderful woman decided to marry me. There we are, her with her big hair, and boy, I had a lot of hair. My kids look at this, they're like, Dad, you had hair! There is the love of my life. She is still the love of my life. And so any chance I get, I tell people marriage is great, and just marry in the Lord. You want to marry somebody who loves Jesus, and my wife does. And we have just had a great marriage. So anyway, this was a great year. This is what kicked it all off. But this is also where we pick up our Willie Horton story. And thank you, Hannah. She is beautiful, was and is still beautiful. Anyway, Willie Horton became an issue during the presidential election of Michael Dukakis and George Bush. That's the first George Bush. I used my favorite picture of Dukakis there. You might be asking, he looks like a military commander, was he? Well, no, here's what happened. People thought he was weak on defense, so some brainiac in his campaign said, hey, let's put him in a tank and make him look tough. But it backfired. Not the tank, that is. The ad. The ad backfired. He became a laughingstock because, and people pointed out, he actually looks like the guy from Mad Magazine. Oh, yeah. The commercial did not help him at all. But anyway, why did Willie Horton become such an issue? Well, Michael Dukakis, who was the governor of Massachusetts, thought it would be rehabilitative for criminals to roam the streets. By the way, this is an example of how worldviews come into play. God says to execute murderers, but sinful man says, wait a minute, no, man is basically good, and if he does hurtful things, it's because he's been mistreated or he's grown up in poverty or blah, 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 right? Remember Aaron Charles Mitchell? So sinful man says, forget what God says, we can fix him. Let's let hardened murderers roam the streets and they'll become better people. Of course, that doesn't even make sense on its face, because if the environment's the problem, how is that going to fix him by letting him roam the streets with that bad environment? I mean, so even that's the problem. If you don't come from God's point of view, you're just going to be so logically inconsistent. But anyway, that's the thinking the way it is. So Dukakis furloughs Willie Horton back in 1986 for 48 hours. Well, guess what happened? Think he shows up after 2 days? Reporting for duty, Governor, sir. No. He fled, and boy, I mean, he fled the state. He never came back. Willie Horton shows up in Oxon Hill, Maryland in April of 1987. And here's where it gets tragic again. Clifford Barnes was a 28-year-old guy at the time. He hears footsteps in his house. He's excited at first. He thinks it's his fiancée that's returned home early from a wedding party. No, Willie Horton steps out of the shadows with a gun. By the way, he's not allowed to have a gun. How does a criminal get a gun when we have gun control laws to prevent this kind of thing from happening? I never will understand that. This is 1987. So he for the next several hours, Horton is punching, pistol whipping, kicking Barnes. Never kills him, thankfully, but he does cut him 22 times across the midsection. Apparently he had a knife fetish or something. Barnes' fiancée eventually does return home. I'll leave out what he does to her because that gets gruesome. He doesn't kill her, but that was not a good, just horrid situation. Well, anyway, he escapes, but Maryland finally captures him and deals with him. Horton is sentenced in Maryland, get this, to 2 consecutive terms plus 85 years. What they're trying to do is make it so that he'll never be eligible for parole. But as you can guess, Maryland and Massachusetts are very reticent to put people to death. Anyway, Massachusetts hears that Maryland has their bad guy, and so Massachusetts asks for him back. I mean, it's just like things are getting, going from bad to worse. But thankfully, the sentencing judge in Maryland refuses to return Horton back to Massachusetts. And this is what he says, quote, "I am not prepared to take the chance that Mr. Horton might again be furloughed or otherwise released. This man should never draw a breath of free air again." And to my knowledge, Willie Horton is still locked up in a Maryland prison, not breathing free air, but prison air. Anyway, as I said, this became a national issue. It showed Dukakis to be weak on crime, and it had devastating consequences for Dukakis' presidential hopes. He lost. But what's interesting about this case is that the founding fathers didn't have this problem. If somebody committed a murder, they were dealt with, they were arrested, tried, convicted, or acquitted. But if they were guilty, they were executed. And all of this could happen within a month, within 1 month. It's amazing. Their justice system was much, much quicker than what we see today. Even as late as 1933, we see justice being carried out very quickly. Take this case that occurred in 1933. In 1933, Joseph Zangara tried to assassinate President Roosevelt. Now, there's Zangara being captured in the upper left, and I don't know why he was in a towel. Maybe they arrested him in the shower or something. I don't know. But anyway, he was trying to assassinate President Roosevelt. There he is in the lower left with the skinny cigar. Kind of looks like the penguin in Batman, doesn't he? Just kind of sitting there, har, har, har. Right? What a crazy thing! It almost makes me wonder if the penguin in Batman is based on FDR. I wouldn't be surprised. But anyway, Zangara's shot missed, and he killed the mayor of Chicago instead. And there you see the mayor of Chicago. Well, here's the deal. It took only 33 days to arrest, prosecute, convict, sentence, and execute Zangara. 33 days. I mean, that is remarkable by today's standards. Punishment was really swift in earlier days. Now it can take 10 to 20 years. I mean, consider a case that finally ended in 2005. Tookie Williams, he's the founder of the Crips. This was back in 1971. Probably heard of the Crips versus the Bloods, right? Well, Tookie Williams founded the Crips. 8 years later, in 1979, he and 3 other guys went on a murder robbery spree that didn't actually get a lot of money, only $250, but it left 4 people dead. And the thing about the murders is that they were notably gratuitous. I mean, for example, he killed this one guy named Albert Owens because, as he said, he was killing all white people. So he was a racist. He hated whites. But not just whites. He killed an elderly Chinese couple and their daughter, whom he referred to as Buddha heads. Tookie Williams killed all of his victims with a 12-gauge shotgun, which he would hold the gun just inches from their quivering bodies and just let them suffer, just seeing the oncoming death before he would finally pull the trigger. He was just out for inflicting maximum damage. Well, Tookie Williams spent 24 years on death row, and as you can see, he had a lot of time to work out in prison. Mrs. Pratt would love it if I had this guy's bouncing biceps. Actually, I always joke her about that. She would actually hate that. She hates that look. She's like, oh, I'm so glad. In fact, it's funny because before I was a Christian, I was really into weightlifting and I wanted to become a professional bodybuilder. She's like, oh, I'm so glad God steered you away from that. I would not find that attractive, she says. So anyway, all in God's providence, right? So that's Tookie Williams after years and years of working out. Well, finally, in 2005, the Governor, as he is known, you know who the Governor is, right? I'll be back. I am the Governor, and I will pump you up. You know who I'm talking about? It's the one and only Arnold, yeah, who became I almost said the Governor of California, the Governor of California back in the 2000s. Well, Arnold finally allowed the execution to go through. And so Williams was executed in December of 2005. But boy, did this spark a huge national, and I mean national, controversy. You might think, what's the big deal? This guy was a thug, right? Well, here's the thing. Leading up to his execution, people talked about how unjust it was to kill Tookie Williams because, after all, in his later years, he had turned sensitive, and he was writing children's books from jail. He even won a Nobel Prize for his children's books. Now, look at what one cartoonist had his dead victims saying from the grave. I would have liked to win a Nobel Prize. I would have loved to have written children's books. I would have loved to have read children's books to my children. In essence, the cartoonist is saying, those of you who want to show mercy to Tookie, what about the victims? Because they weren't shown any mercy. I thought it is brilliant. It's very well done. Now, having said that, I realize that capital punishment is very controversial today. Certainly, in terms of the liberal media who typically oppose capital punishment, but even in the Christian community, this can be a divisive topic. So how fun that we're talking about it, right? But let me ask you this, and let's go back, let's review. How do we explain to people? Good question, Hannah, and let's say that because by the time we get to the end of class, we will be addressing that. Oh, that's funny. I mean, it's kind of morbidly funny, but let me ask you a quiz question, okay? Every class period, we've got to have a little fun quiz question. We're talking about capital punishment. When was capital punishment instituted? Now don't answer yet, and by capital punishment, I mean government officials executing criminals? Was it at, here's your three choices, at Mount Sinai, before Mount Sinai, or after Mount Sinai? So your three choices are at, before, or after Mount Sinai. Of course, Mount Sinai being when God gave Moses the law. So was capital punishment instituted at, before, or after Mount Sinai? All right, I'll count to three, and then you guys give me your answers. 1, 2, 3, hit it. Ella says before. Adelaide says after. Before. Well, right after the flood, not by government. Before. So look, this is interesting. Almost all of you said before. In section 1, almost all of them said at or after. Does anybody want to see? I wonder if it's because the first person, Ella, said before, and then like everybody follows. Makes you wonder. Anybody want to change their answers? Okay, now we have one at. All right. Well, drum roll, please. When was capital punishment first instituted by God? Actually, Christina gave us the precise answer. It would have been before Mount Sinai because it was right after the flood. And here's the verse to prove it. Right after they're coming out of the ark, God says to Noah, "Now, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For in the image of God has God made man." Now, Hannah, you said you thought I said by government. Well, I did say government in the sense of that's what capital punishment is. It's government officials executing criminals. And see, here's the thing. There was no government before the flood. Before the flood, God, or at least not officially, God had not given the power of the sword. It's not until Genesis 9 that you see that man now has the authority to shed man's blood in certain cases, like when man has shed somebody's blood illegally or unlawfully, then man can shed his blood. Now, just to show you that this is the first time this is happening, who committed the first murder? So the right answer, right, was before Mount Sinai, right. And Cain was the first murderer, right? I mean, Cain was a problem child all his life. Although some put the blame partly at his parents' feet. I mean, you know, Adam and Eve, they were raising Cain as long as they were able. Some of you were maybe taking notes and like, what? Wait a minute, Mr. Pratt. No, okay. What was Cain's punishment? See, this is very important. What was Cain's punishment? To be a wanderer. Was anybody allowed to put him to death? In fact, intrinsically, Cain felt like that was perhaps the just punishment because he asked God about that. You know, somebody will find me and kill me. And God says no, because why? What did God do? He actually put a mark on him. Now, we don't know what that mark was. But here's the point. Capital punishment was not allowed until after the flood. That is when the sword is given to man. And in Romans 13, we see that it's the government that has that sword to put people to death. So after the flood, God gives the power of the sword to execute murderers and to execute them as it happens. I think that's one reason why God says another global flood will not be needed, because God would, God performed capital punishment himself with the flood, but now it's government that can take away a criminal's life, take away his rights, life, liberty, property, etc. And Genesis 9 is the first time that this happens. Does that make sense? I mean, are you tracking with that? Does that make sense? So there was no capital punishment before the flood. After the flood, there is capital punishment. And then at Mount Sinai, we see specific examples of what deserves capital punishment. So, we see it fleshed out a little bit. But as I alluded to earlier, this is a theme that's carried on into the New Testament. Notice Romans 13:4, for he, that is the civil authority, is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is God's minister, an avenger. Okay, not like the superheroes. Okay, we're not talking about Iron Man. Government is not like Hulk or, Spider-Man or Iron Man or something like that. No, he's an avenger. He takes revenge to execute wrath on him who practices evil. We as individuals are not allowed to take revenge. The civil authority is allowed to take revenge. So what are the civil authorities empowered to do? They're to bear the sword. They're an avenger, to take revenge, to execute wrath on people who commit crimes. Now, again, before the flood, God was the avenger. But since the flood, God authorizes the civil government to take revenge on murderers and other criminals. And yet, as you saw in the DVD, there's that story from Jesus' life. And this, in part, I think gets to Hannah's question. Now that Jesus has come, isn't this one of those things that we're going to do differently? And after all, he lets the woman go. So doesn't this story invalidate the death penalty? What about the woman caught in adultery? Does that invalidate the death penalty? What do you think? What about it? She wasn't taking a life, but adultery in many circumstances could demand the death penalty. Not in every circumstance. This was actually kind of an interesting crime where it could go one of two ways. It could go back to repaying the victim, that is the aggrieved spouse, or it could take the death penalty. Did he No, he didn't specifically say that. Yeah, what was it? What was the problem in this story? I mean, Jesus didn't send her off to the gallows. And so if this story doesn't overrule the death penalty, why not? What was the problem in this story? What was missing? They only brought the woman, not the man. Yeah, that surprised you? I mean, had you ever seen that in this story? You know, I know it's not something that occurred to me the first few hundred times that I read it. But, the religious leaders were not following biblical, and by the way, I'm not the only person that has made this point or seen this. And actually, I'm not even sure I was the first person or that I thought of this on my own. I'm pretty sure somebody pointed this out, but it was like, oh my goodness, this makes so much sense. Because, you saw that in the DVD. The Jews were directly violating God's laws, and that's actually a huge issue with God. Not following God's laws. Jesus was rebuking them all the time for not following God's laws. And you might remember what he said in Matthew 5, which we've I didn't come to abolish the law or the prophets, not until heaven and earth pass away. He made that very clear. And as pointed out in the DVD, a fair and honest judicial process is important to God. Remember this verse from the DVD? On the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, a man shall be put to death, but no one shall be put to death on the testimony of only one witness. So what happens if there's only one witness to a crime, even though the defendant, the person who's on trial, really committed the murder? What happens if there's truly only one witness, only one piece of evidence? What does God say should happen? Wait, God would actually allow a criminal to walk? You can't read Deuteronomy 17:6 without coming away from that conclusion that, yeah, there will be situations where a criminal walks free. Thus, we should not be surprised that Jesus had a criminal walk free. The criminal being because adultery was a crime. But why would God allow, let's say, a murderer to go free? I mean, what if there was one witness or one strong piece of evidence? Why would God let them go free? I mean, doesn't God care about law and order? Doesn't he want bad people to be brought to justice? It's an important point to understand about God, and Christina got it, and Ben got it. He's protecting the innocent. It's protecting the innocent from mistakes. It's protecting a person from being framed. So there is a lot of, I mean, what you have to ask is, what's the alternative? If, somebody can be sent to the gallows on the testimony of only one piece of evidence or one person, then you can have a lot of framing jobs or a lot of mistakes made. See, again, to really understand why Jesus would allow this adulteress to go free when she's guilty, you really have to understand that God's word demands there will be situations when guilty people go free. And, this is one of the biggest mistakes that our justice system still makes today. There are people who so badly want law and order, and by the way, that's not a bad desire. I mean, God is a just judge, so law and order is not bad, but they want law and order so bad that they can't tolerate the idea that a crime might go unsolved. And, God does want us to solve crimes. Doing the whole NCIS and, all that cool stuff. I mean, that's stuff that God has given us to use. He wants us to solve crimes. Again, it's part of his nature. He's a perfect judge. But even he says there are proper procedures for convicting a murderer. And sometimes there may be so little evidence that a guilty person goes free. In the Government 2 class that I teach in the second semester, we look at this more in depth, and I discuss what it means to have more than one witness. Does it only refer to eyewitnesses, or can physical evidence also be considered a witness, biblically speaking? We look at that, and I show you a video of a guy who was mistakenly put on death row for several years, and he was there because our legal system does not follow the verse that you see on the screen right now. That's why he sadly spent so many years on death row. But you'll have to wait till next semester to see what happened to him. But anyway, you should remember these other passages from the DVD which indicate, once again, God is very interested in a fair and honest judicial process. With the woman caught in adultery, the Jews were horribly violating God's procedures that give people due process of law, right? I mean, they were violating them. Anyway, make sure you go over these passages that were on the DVD. Hopefully you were taking notes when you watch it. But quickly, I want to look at a video which is a sad case. And it's sad because it underscores how in this country we don't always abide by the clear directive in this verse in Deuteronomy 17:6. In fact, I dare say that most countries don't go by this, where, not holding off on convicting somebody by requiring 2 or more pieces of evidence. But the clear directive from God is you don't put somebody to death on the testimony of just one witness. Now, in this video here, you're going to see talk of 2 criminals. And that reminds me, I needed to get you this is going to, let me put this first one in your chat box. And then let me go ahead and give you the second one. Go ahead and load these and then pause it. Should have done that at the beginning of class. Sorry about that. Anyway, in this first one, I'll just talk while you guys are doing this. You're going to see talk of 2 criminals. Again, Carlos de Luna and Carlos Hernandez. So there's 2 Carloses, all right? Carlos de Luna, just so you keep it straight, he's the guy who is apparently wrongly executed. Carlos Hernandez, the other Carlos, is the one who apparently committed the murder and should have been the one that was executed and punished. Now, take the first link that I gave you and stop at 2 minutes and 33 seconds and then tell me when you're done. Okay, so stop it at 233 and tell me when you're done. Go. All right. So a couple of folks weren't able to watch it. So just to recap, the story is on a guy, apparently the wrong guy, being executed. It's a sad story. Now let me ask you this question. How many witnesses or pieces of evidence were there to this murder? One and only one. And from what I can tell, it wasn't a frame job or anything like that, but it was just simply a case of mistaken identity, which is one reason why God requires two or three to prevent that type of thing. I mean, after all, what would God's word say should happen in such a case where there is no other evidence that points to DeLuna being the murderer? He should go free. Yeah, but sadly, we don't often abide by that standard anymore because we've gotten away from God's word. Now, before we end, I want to show you what a famous actor has to say about the death penalty. And he's against the death penalty, but I want you to hear what his primary reasoning is for why we shouldn't have the death penalty. Now, this one, even though it's a longer video, you can stop it at 25 seconds. So go from the beginning to 25 seconds. See if you can catch in that 25 seconds what it is that is his primary reasoning for why we shouldn't have the death penalty. Go ahead and go, and then tell me when you're done. All right, like I said, this one goes quickly. So what is Jeremy Irons' point about the death penalty? It doesn't fix anything, doesn't reduce crime rates, doesn't make a difference, doesn't work, right? Okay, let me ask you this. We've been talking about worldviews. What does this reveal about his worldview? That is, what is punishment all about in his view? Ultimately, it is about the environment. Ultimately, it is what effect will this have on society? And if it's not reducing crime rates, then it's not an effective form of punishment. See, in his worldview, law is an instrument to fix society. Now, even if it is true that capital punishment has no deterrent value, what would be your answer to Mr. Irons? And by the way, I question whether that's true. I mean, for one thing, you know how many murders we have a year in the United States? We have 20,000 murders every year. Do you know how many executions we have every year? Well, we do actually have some, but it's nowhere close to keeping up with 20,000. It's about 100 a year all across the country. In fact, there was one just earlier this week that made national news because it was a woman who was being executed in Georgia. Yeah. And so a lot of people thought, oh, it's a woman, so they shouldn't kill a woman, But basically, I mean, this woman had hired a boyfriend to kill her husband. I mean, you know, yeah, murder is murder. Yeah, but so that's 0.5% of the murderers that are getting executed. So if it's not acting as a deterrent, maybe that's why. Maybe because we're not really doing it. But even if it was true, even if 20,000 murders, let's say we were executing 19,000 of them. I mean, and it had no deterrent value. What would be the answer to Mr. Irons? So even if he's right, he's wrong. Why? Well, you would think, people would think about it, and you would think it would be a deterrent. And actually, the scripture says in Ecclesiastes chapter 8 that when a crime is not punished quickly, people feel it is safe to do wrong. It's Ecclesiastes 8:11. So actually, the Bible tells us that by not punishing crime quickly, we will reduce the deterrence effect. So it's not that capital punishment doesn't deter, it's really the way we're implementing it. But ultimately, it's not even about deterrence. It was Ecclesiastes 8:11, so written by Solomon. The ultimate answer to Jeremy Irons is that it's not about deterrence. Punishment is not about cleaning up the environment. It's not about, deterring others, although that is a side benefit. It's ultimately about God's justice. Now, I'm sure that's not an argument that Jeremy Irons would acknowledge as worthwhile. But see, here's the clash of worldviews. Ultimately, punishment is about God's justice. God authorizes civil government to punish wrongdoers, and so government must punish criminals the way that God, the author of government, says they should be punished. Now, that would be a good answer. I mean, it's a good answer for us to make anyway, certainly a good answer for Christians, but, the Bible says that we should answer by truth, but then the Bible also says answer the fool according to his folly. So what would be pragmatic arguments to Mr. Irons? What would be pragmatic arguments in favor of the death penalty? I mean, one argument would be that if we don't deal with them that way, then the practice is that for whatever reason, through parole or through the overwhelming tax burdens, these killers get sent back onto the street. And what happens when that happens? They kill again. You know, the Willie Horton example. They end up killing again, and a high percentage of them will commit crimes and kill again. And so, you know, again, ultimately, it's not about deterrence. It's about justice. It's about restitution. When a person steals, then their money is forfeit. When a person sheds someone else's blood, their life should be forfeit. And that will have a deterrent effect. Again, the reason why we don't see crime having a deterrence effect is because we're barely not even doing it. I mean, it's hardly proper to say that we have a death penalty when it's only 100 out of 20,000 murders that are actually receiving it. And quite frankly, but in the man-centered view, it sees sin or wrongdoing as being most